Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1748. And we will do a tryout. Because of lack of time, we're going to do preemptively a little bit of Paul Horwich, widely recommended book, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. I have just began to read it, but we're not going to go any further than we read. My dear colleague Kalle has chosen some pages, so we will see this as a first tryout. Let's see here. Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. So this is where we start. Okay, we are at page, in the PDF it's 26, in the book it is 8, page 8. The role of language. Part of Wittgenstein's view is that the distinctively philosophical confusion arises when the misleading picture is derived from language. In the Blue Book, he says, the man who is philosophically puzzled sees a law in the way a word is used, and trying to apply this law consistently comes up against paradoxical results. And in the philosophical investigations, our investigation is therefore a grammatical one. Such an investigation sheds light on our problems by clearing misunderstandings away. Misunderstandings concerning the use of words, caused, among other things, by certain analogies between the forms of expression in different regions of language. these are, of course, not empirical problems. They are solved rather by looking into the workings of our language, and in such a way as to make us recognize those workings. In despite of an urge to misunderstand them, the problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have already known. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. A picture held us captive, and we could not get outside of it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably. Let's look at a few examples of such problems, beginning with some that are relatively superficial and easy to dissolve. If you do not know much mathematics, you might be quite impressed and mystified by the contention that every straight line intersects every circle, but sometimes only at imaginary points. But one can be amazed only to the extent that one doesn't appreciate that the words intersect and imaginary have each been given special technical meanings, whereby, for example, the circle represented by x up to 2 plus y2 equals 3, and the line represented by x equals 2 are said to intersect at the values of x and y that simultaneously satisfy both equations, which are the so-called imaginary points. 2.I and 2.-I. unaware of these shifts in sense, one may well think that the fundamental rules governing our ordinary use of the words intersect and imaginary remain in force and account for their deployment in the mathematician's surprising contention. But it is impossible to see how they could possibly do so. Thus, the source of philosophical bewilderment, easily removed in this case, is a natural tendency on hearing a word to assign it the meaning with which one is familiar. Similarly, suppose a psychologist claims to have discovered the existence of unconscious pain. Now, there are many fantastic things: black holes, nanochips, 11-dimensional superstrings, and so on, whose reported discovery by science provokes no particular reaction in the philosophical world. But this sort of claim is likely to hit a peculiar nerve. There will be protest to the effect that, regardless of the predicative and explanatory power of the unconscious pain theory, it must be rejected as incoherent. The very idea of an unconscious pain being self-contradictory. But again, the source of confusion is not difficult to identify. As just illustrated, we tend to forget that the meaning of a word is something we bestow, not usually explicitly by means of a deliberate stipulation, but often implicitly, merely by using the words in a certain ways, so that a change in its meaning does not require an overt redefinition, but may come about through a shift in its fundamental pattern of deployment. as a consequence, despite the extreme tension involved in trying to combine our basic ordinary use of the word pain and its proposed use within the scientific theory, we resist dissolving that tension by acknowledging a degree of ambiguity. Which would amount to our not allowing the two uses to be combined in inference. And so we are left with a choice between either tolerating the irresolvable perplexities that this combination engenders, or refusing to accept the new theory. But this false dilemma is easily avoided. The remedy, quite clearly, is not to be mesmerized by the word, but to appreciate how distinct uses of it, hence somewhat distinct meanings, may evolve and proliferate. Perhaps even more importantly, a common way for us to be misled by language, according to Wittgenstein, is that when we see a noun appearing as the subject of a true sentence, we expect there to be a thing to which the noun refers. This expectation comes from reflection on countless statements such as Neptune is a planet, Boston has subways, Plato taught philosophy. Which suggests a universal underlying semantic structure for all sentences of that simplistic, simple, syntactic type. The subject, a noun, phrase, picks out a particular object in the world, and the rest of the sentence denotes some property or characteristic attributed to that object. One context in which a fixation upon this pattern can cause headaches is in the analysis of negative existential statements such as Father Christmas does not exist. Overgeneralizing from the previous examples, one might conclude that no such statement can be true. For in order to be true, its subject would have to succeed in designating something which the sentence goes on to say is non-existent. Now. Therefore, the statement could be true only if it were also false, and therefore could not be true. The following remark of Wittgenstein's seems quite apt. When we do philosophy, we are like savages, primitive people who hear the expressions of civilized men, put a false interpretation on them, and then draw the queerest conclusions from it. Odd objects. The case of numbers. But as far as Wittgenstein is concerned, the most danger associated with noun phrases is of a different kind. We tend to assimilate sentences such as time is one-dimensional, 7 is a prime, my afterimage is red. To the preceding cases, we suppose, in other words, that the terms time, 7, my afterimage, pick out things in the world. Then, since the paradigmatic thing is a physical object, a stone, a table, a planet, and so on, we are inclined to ask the sort of questions about time, 7, and afterimages that could normally be asked about our ordinary physical objects. For example, Where is it located? What is it made of? How do other things interact with it? How can information about it reach us? Our inability to give satisfactory answers to these questions can leave the impression that the phenomena at issue, time, numbers, experiences, are either hopelessly mysterious or else could not really be as we naively take them to be. Where our language suggests a body, there is none. There, we should like to say, is a spirit. We quickly arrive at our characteristic questions of the form. How is it possible for there to exist such a thing as X, which I illustrated above? These puzzles, in Wittgenstein's view, however, these puzzles are merely pseudo questions, the product of analogies which, perversely exaggerated, assimilate the entities named to physical objects. So we can dissolve the problems by removing the temptation to overstretch the analogies. For concreteness, let us focus for a moment on the case of numbers. A straightforward reading of arithmetical assertions, for example, a construal of 7 is a prime, as analogous in semantic structure to Neptune is a planet. Suggests a realm of mathematical reality, the numbers whose properties it is the purpose of mathematics to discover and describe. But this can seem paradoxical and mystifying, for we cannot see how locations could conceivably be ascribed to numbers. Yet, how could a genuine object not exist in space or time? nor can we see how numbers could exhibit any sort of causal influence on our beliefs about them. Yet surely knowledge of genuine objects would require some such interaction. One response to these puzzles, we might call it Mysterian Platonism, has been to acknowledge that numbers are objects of an essentially bizarre kind. Objects that can inexplicably exist beyond space and time, and inexplicably impress themselves on our cognitive faculties. Reacting against such mystery mongering, another theoretical move has been to deny, given the paradoxical nature, that there could be, or at least that there could be known to be, such things as numbers, but then to remove some of the sting from this denial by maintaining that we can and should, for practical and scientific reasons, go along with the fiction that standard arithmetic is true. However, it is far from clear that such a have your cake and eat it response is coherent. An alternative reaction against Mysterian Platonism has been to revise mathematics itself in such a way as to remove its unpalatable commitments. In particular, the intuitionist constructivist hold that the world of mathematical objects must be a human invention or construction. This suggests to them that there can be nothing more to mathematical truth than probability from the accepted axioms of mathematics, and this in turn leads them to abandon the classical law of excluded middle. that every statement of the form P or not P is true, then there are attempts to avoid the weirdness of ethereal Platonic objects via some sort of reductionist account. But to the extent that a given proposal promises to demystify numbers by reducing them to unproblematic physical entities, it will seem highly implausible. And to the extent that it seeks to avoid this implausibility by proposing to reduce them to other abstracta, then no significant demystification will be achieved. Finally, it might be hoped that the needed clarity and understanding are best promoted by means of a superficial systematization of our arithmetical beliefs. For example, a piano-style axiomatization, but such a thing is not easy to come by, as Gödel proved. Moreover, it is hard to see how a mere compression of our convictions could touch any of the ontological or epistemological puzzlement that they initially provoked. Despite their opposition to one another, the fictionalists, constructivists, logicists, axiologists, and the Mysterian Platonists share a fundamental assumption, namely that to take our mathematical discourse at face value requires the adoption of a metaphysical picture with many attendant difficulties. In other words, all these theorists feel the force of certain dilemma: either accept arithmetic understood naively and be confronted with extreme philosophical perplexities, or avoid those perplexities, but pay the price with a peculiar mathematics, or a contrived construal of mathematical practice, or both. Wittgenstein's view was that we must expose and exercise the single misconception that is responsible for this false dilemma. We should learn to see that neither arithmetical discourse nor the natural interpretation of it as referring to an abstract, mind-independent reality need necessarily carry with them the property of puzzlement about the nature, location, and accessibility of that reality. The basic mistake, in his view, is the expectation that philosophy can and should deliver a priori theories that, like good scientific theories, are simple, unifying, and explanatory. It's this background presupposition that inclines us to exaggerate the analogies between talking about planets and talking about numbers, to therefore raise the same questions about numbers that we normally ask about planets, and to be perplexed when we cannot answer them. Wittgenstein therapy is reminding us of the highly idiosyncratic character and function of arithmetical discourse, relieves the grip of these tempting over simplifications without requiring any modification either of standard mathematics or of the naive idea that numbers are abstract objects, or our naive aspiration to discover what is true about them. One six are questions and objections. Having briefly described and illustrated Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy, I'd like to end the chapter by mentioning some of the many skeptical questions that this introduction should provoke, issues that I will address in the next chapter. First, could there be a precise articulation of Wittgenstein's metaphilosophical view, including clear ways of characterizing overstretched analogies, pseudo problems, and philosophical perplexities, and an account of the processes by which aspects of language induce these phenomena. Second, turning from the content of this doctrine to the justification for accepting it. What general reason is there to agree with his claim that nothing of any depth is to be learned by doing philosophy in the traditional theoretical way? This is certainly not self-evident, yet he does not appear to provide any argument over and above a series of examples for adopting such a pessimistic point of view. Third, there would appear to be solid reason to disagree. Surely, there are philosophical problems in, for example, ethics, mathematical logic, naturalistic epistemology, and the foundations of physics. Problems addressed by people who rightly takes themselves to be philosophers, that do not have the character Wittgenstein describes, and from whose solution we think important knowledge might well be gained. Fourth, a further objection. He says that the goal of philosophy is not to formulate and establish theories, but rather to clear away confusions produced by language. But is not this a claim about the nature of philosophy itself, a theory? So isn't Wittgenstein's metaphilosophy self-contradictory? Fifth, and bearing on both the nature of and basis for that view, it is clear that his skepticism about the prospect of radical discoveries within philosophy precedes and helps explain his other doctrines. In particular, his account of meaning as use. For it is widely held, on the contrary, for example, by Baker, Dummett, Hacker, Katz, Kripke, Peirce, Soames, that Wittgenstein's metaphilosophical conservatism, the sacrosanct status of ordinary language, itself issues from his conception of meaning. And that's 45 minutes and time for a summary. Conception of meaning is the end. You go to page 11. Here, Paul Horwich is pointing out something that is very common. And that is that people are confusing superficial grammar with an underlying assumed reality. And the examples there, I will not repeat them, they are quite a bit further down, the third paragraph. They are quite simple. It's Neptune is a planet, Boston has subverse, Plato taught philosophy. And Father Christmas further down does not exist. That problem I met so many times, and it's explained to be real by people of sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so forth. It is extremely common. Superficial structure is mistaken for reality. So the questions and conclusions, and especially the explanations that come after, are untrue at best. I'd say that they actually are nonsensical. Numbers, next page 12. Numbers is extremely common, and I think one of the reasons that Wittgenstein focused on numbers is that's his own interest, but also his early mentor, or his mentor in the early stages, Bertrand Russell, was a mathematical genius. He held the mathematical objects to be real, that is Russell. And that, as pointed out by Horwich, leads to inexorable, intractable problems. So what you might want to do, and suggested here in the text, is to go the other way. If not Platonism, why not go to intuitionism? that all of a sudden you get another problem, less severe, but still you get a problem, as we can see on page 14, where there's a mentioning of the intuitionist solution. All is man-made. And apart from that, there is a third so-called solution to the problem, and that we find on page 15. A piano-style axiomatization, 7 lies down. And then we learn from Kurt Gödel that is not possible to reach. And I'd say today, most mathematicians and other people, all people of academia without exception, are prone to axiomatization. And that is the idea that the world is pre-organized by eternal laws, either as Gödel thought it to be, axioms that underlined and was the foundation of the theorems of mathematics in a sort of cause and effect order, connected to each other. And eternal, of course, never changing, being forever and ever. Having no use, not participating in any game, and so forth and so forth. We know now that is completely unreal. And all the different strivings that are counted up here, and I said, every single person of academia today belongs to one of these categories. And we find them on paragraph 3. And they are fictionalists, constructivists, logicists, axiologists, and Mysterian Platonists. They all share a fundamental assumption, namely that to take on mathematical discourse, and it could be anthropology, archaeology, theology, at discourse, at face value, requires an adoption of a metaphysical picture with many attendant difficulties. My old professor in anthropology said that there were cultural objects that build up culture. In theology that Kalle often mentions, there are original objects, non-existent, never in touch with any reality that exists beyond this world and are originals, causative of what we think today or what we should think and so on. And the connection there is nothing but peculiar or odd or eerie. Very hard to explain how the connection is between this original as causative. And of course, this is very similar to the initial conditions of the universe that are never explained, what they came from. And they are very convenient because they build up the eternal classical laws that a priori decides everything of the past, of the now, and of the future. Wittgenstein clearly points out, as we read in previous articles, it's very hard to make sense of it when you really examine it hard. We have some objections. The objections, I will only mention one, and because that's the most common objection. It's made by all famous philosophers. You find them at the third paragraph of page 17. And these gentlemen are, 4 of these I read carefully, 2 others I read somewhat, and only one is more or less unknown to me, or that's Soames. Baker, Dummett, Hacker, Katz, Kripke, Pearce, and Soames. They are extremely important in England and especially the Nordic countries. They rule all the subjects here in Sweden. Kripke has even been to Gothenburg. They all assume that there is a specific conception, a priori once more, in Wittgenstein. So they made him a priori once more. And that shows how very tempting it is to make something a priori. It's ingrained in our thinking. We look for the original, we get some sort of initial conditions that decides everything. There is a connection between the initial conditions unknown, of course, because everything that's not participatory, like the initial conditions, or an original that is found at the bottom of a well or in a big pit, hasn't participated, will be transcendental. All things that don't participate have no great meaning, or very little or superficial meaning. So this is, of course, very similar to the ideas of Roberto Unger and Lee Smolin. Also the objections from Carlo Rovelli, and we also mentioned early Marletta Ciagliano, I think her name was, who had the theory of the counterfactuals. Counterfactuals also show that we have to some extent use of the idea of existence in physics, but it always needs to be accompanied by non-existence. So that's to make for harmony. Kalle, please go ahead.
Thank you. Your point that we could often translate a priori with original. So I like this. A priori is like the original. In my case, it's the original text, the original Bible text that supposedly exists there somewhere.
Yes.
In the pathologic world.
Yes. Sorry.
So it's a very good paragraph, this on page 33, that you could use against the concept of original text, original Bible text. And so I like this. So this was on page 15. Let me go to the very first page, page 8. PDF is 26, page 8. So the very first quotation is from Wittgenstein is delightful. The man who is philosophically puzzled sees a law in the way a word is used, and trying to apply this law consistently, and comes up against paradoxical results.
Yes, indeed.
So this is, as recently as today, I read about a scholar who tries to use computers to determine meanings in ancient texts. So this is this text by Wittgenstein is very useful. As imagine that computers can come up magically what a word means exactly in ancient texts. The text. Let me go to the next page, which continues on in this line of thought. It's actually page 10. Let me see, page 10. Let me not jump too much. So this is page 10. And yes, it's here. I love this. This is a continuation of the thing on page 8. And what I just said. We tend to forget the meaning of a word is something we bestow, not usually explicitly by means of a relevant stipulation, but often implicitly, merely by using the word in certain ways, so that a change in its meaning does not require an overt redefinition, but may come about through a shift in its fundamental pattern of deployment. As a consequence, despite the extra tension involved in trying to combine our basic ordinary use of the word pain and its proposed use within scientific theory, we resist dissolving the tension by acknowledging a degree of ambiguity and so forth.
Very good, yeah.
Yes, so this is on here on page. So why is this important? Well, so let's say that you would use computers to try to determine meanings in ancient texts. I think that the computers use explicit thinking.
Yes,
I am
yes.
certain that they use only explicit thinking, but not this implicit thinking.
No.
And we can compare with this with the problem of the Chinese room. Was it Chinese room?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that means that this philosophical problem means that a computer could what to say create and understand the Chinese language to a certain degree, but here you have an explanation. Okay, it could to a certain degree understand, but computer can never understand the implicit meanings of a word. Do you agree, Hans?
Yes, yes, definitely. As you just read here, it's it can come about because of a fundamental change in the context and everything. And that aspect change is a necessity for consequent meaning. But I think the people who do not get that the whole way out, also to speak, not realizing it's doesn't make any sense with transcendental identity that something is same. Same is something perpetually happening. It's the game once more. A pass in football will never be the same in this metaphysical Tegmarkian Everetian way, but it's still the same. Now I say it's the same in a very real way in how we use the words properly, whereas the philosophers lost it somewhere, and a priori out of the world same doesn't really mean anything. That's the explicit mistake, that only the explicit exists.
Yes, absolutely. And to make a reference to popular culture, the famous author of the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, he wrote a book in 2017 called Origin. And it's very similar to this idea, actually, almost. So there you have a computer that could absolutely pass a Turing test. It convinces a speaker. In that case, it was an English speaker that the program itself is a live English speaker.
Oh.
It's a very good read, especially if you're interested in visiting Spain, because it's located in Spain.
Oh, thank you for the recommendation.
And let me go back to the access. So here we have an answer. The Chinese room experiment is not possible. The thought experiment is not possible because the computer cannot understand implicit meanings. Or where, Hans, where do we have the AI development today? Is it possible?
Well, I'm just going to say here, it's extremely convincing, and it convinces a lot of people. But the reason for it being so convincing is we are fixated on the explicit today. And if it's not possible, Kalle, to have a proper implicit AI, but if we did have one, I think people wouldn't be that impressed of it. Because the explicit AI that we have today, it's incredibly good with formulations, a lot of words. It sounds very intellectual. It uses words indiscriminately, that like most academia today, not like it used to be. It doesn't sound nice, which usually today is a sign of excellence. So it fools all those, because academia has been explicit for, let's say, 80, 90 years now, or 70. So it fits like hand in glove what we mean by thinking today. But as Wittgenstein points out, that has nothing to do with thinking at all. It's just a superficial aspect of it. And the question asked and the question answered are meaningless, completely useless.
And one, speaking of implicit meaning, so to return to the book, Dan Brown's book Origin, the only one thing that the computer cannot do, except running and so forth, physical things, but we are now speaking about intellectual things, is that it doesn't understand humor. In the book of Dan Brown, it actually, the computer asks the protagonist of the book, Professor Langdon, to teach him humor. So it's actually interesting to see future computers understand implicit things like humor.
Well, I think to a certain degree, I think that will acquire humor, but it will be a standardized a priori humor.
Absolutely.
And, I think there's a good example in our own country where we imported English humor. This is actually true. It started in the 70s, and we've been importing loads of English humor. And what happened by time, we imitated it, and there were even people who said that we have a very great sense of humor in Sweden, and we didn't have before, and all of a sudden we have it. It takes only working with some Englishmen, as I did a year, to understand there are differences. I cannot adjust. I am following a priori rules. I did learn how to laugh at the right moment and so forth. But I am just AI when it comes to English humor. But I can do Swedish humor. Which I think I just did now. A bit cynical. Very funny. I like the text. I will arrange something with Paul Horwich in a couple of days or half a week or something, so we can read through it.
Horwich is actually the first analytical philosopher that I like, if you can put the label analytical on Horwich.
Oh, yeah, he's an easy read. And I will prepare it. I'll start reading it tomorrow or during the weekend, so we can start with it pretty soon. Oh, excellent. It was great fun. I think we need a good laugh, and I think it has something to do that I met an AT teacher before today here. I also feel that my voice improved a bit, although I'm physically a bit tired here. Well, I think thank you very much, Kalle Lundahl, for your participation and your, as always, very thoughtful and insightful comments. Thank you, everyone, for who's listening in. Have a very nice morning, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are. Do take care. Bye-bye for now.